From Southern California, this is The Circle of Insight, a show about everything in psychology. Hear the latest in news and views on psychology. Our motto is simple: wherever there is psychology involved, we are there. And now, here's your host of The Circle of Insight, Carlos Vazquez.
From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring Russia. What's going on with Russia? We're going to find out in a unique way. We're going to see how they perceive the world and some of the issues that are going on. We're also going to figure out geopolitics, which is a complicated issue, but we have a gentleman who's going to help us answer it in a simple way. Dr. Andrei Kortunov. He is Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council and President of the New Eurasia Foundation in Moscow. Let's welcome to the circle, Dr. Kortunov. How are you, sir?
Thank you. I'm fine.
Well, I know you wrote an extensive article on geopolitics, and this is a complicated issue. So if you can answer me this, what is geopolitics?
Well, some say that it is just a pseudoscience which tries to explain events in the world which cannot be explained otherwise. Some believe that this is a field of research which studies natural divisions between countries, nations, and these divisions allegedly are based on some constant factors like climate or the place where a person lives. And basically it means that we are predetermined to make wars and to argue with each other, because those who live in the maritime areas cannot really cohabitate with those who live in the continental areas, and so on and so forth. I think that this theory is not really an academic field. I think it's more about propaganda. It's more about ideology. In a way, it is a kind of religion.
I completely agree with that. Now, it's interesting, because in your paper you mentioned geopolitics, but it almost sounds like you're saying propaganda has enhanced the rift between Russia and the U.S. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you look at the Russia's interests and that of the United States, you will not find a lot of reasons to collide, because we do not have territorial disputes between the two of us. We do not have a fight about resources. We do not have even some kind of ideological rifts, because Russia is no longer a communist state. So basically there is no reason why Russia and the United States should oppose each other. However, we can see that this Cold War mentality is still with us, and the two countries perceive each other as kind of arch enemies, or at least as opponents, serious enough to put them in the center of their foreign policy agendas.
Let me ask you this question. Do you think, and I'm referring to both countries here at all times, do you think the politicians use that to gain favor, or to gain more, more favor with their constituents, with their voters, to try to pit us against an enemy per se, or somebody who's doing something we don't agree with? Do you think both sides are doing that?
Well, I'm not in a position to talk about the United States, and I think that the United States has many other problems to take care of, but definitely this is true for Russia. We have many problems in the Russian economy, in the Russian social development, and right now the leadership might look for this tension as a source of legitimacy, because it is almost like a country at war. And a country at war has different sources of legitimacy compared to a country at peace.
That's a good point. It's a very good point. So I guess we're going to go right into the woods here. What is really going on over there between Russia and the Ukraine? I hear both sides of the story. Some of the congressmen here said, hey, look, some of those people in the Ukraine and the East, they want to go to Russia. Other people say, no, Russia's just trying to take them over there. What is really going on?
Well, it is a very complicated story, of course, because Russia and Ukraine have been a single state for more than 3 centuries, I think 3.5 centuries. And definitely these two nations are very close to each other. And some Russians would say that Ukrainians as a separate nation do not even exist, which I think is not true. Ukrainians do have their own culture and their own language, but this culture and this language are really close to that of Russians. So you cannot really draw a line between Russia and Ukraine. And right now a part of Ukrainians decided that they should take a different development path. that they might join NATO, for example. They might want to join the European Union. And that created, of course, a kind of domestic divide within Ukraine itself. But Russians believed that they should support those in Ukraine who opt for the maybe less European, more pro-Russian choice. And at the same time, of course, Ukraine has a problem of 20 years of mismanagement, corruption. So the state itself in Ukraine is very fragile. It's very fragile. It is saturated with corruption. It has many problems. And of course, many people living in the east of Ukraine believe that with Russians they might be better off. So there is an internal divide, and Russia, at least the Russian leadership, decided that Russia cannot stay outside of this problem, and that Russia should support those who feel that Ukraine should stay closer to Russia. So we see this very complicated situation. We see the two regions of Ukraine which do not want to abide by the decrees and by the orders that they receive from Kiev. You see a very special situation in Crimea, which is predominantly Russian and which would like to rejoin Russia. And we see the West, which of course doesn't like the situation because the West believes that this situation is a very clear violation of international law. So we have a civil war with some kind of foreign interference. And unfortunately, at this stage of the conflict, it's very difficult to predict how the conflict would end and what will terminate this bloody conflict in the east of Ukraine.
Yeah, that's the sad thing. Is a lot of innocent people are dying.
Yeah.
And that actually brings an interesting question. I know one of my questions was, should America even get involved in this? But it isn't. There are such blurry lines, because like you said, there are people who are trying to come back to Russia. We know the Ukrainian economy is not doing fabulous. They might try to get a better life over in Russia. What do you think? Should America get involved, or should we just back off?
Well, my take is that it's mostly a European issue because Europeans, I mean Europeans in the European Union, not just other Europeans, but Europeans in Central Europe, in Western Europe will be affected and are already affected directly by this conflict. There are refugees, and of course they don't want to have a black hole immediately on their borders. For the United States, I think the problem is probably less important. It's more geopolitical than a problem of their specific interests. And moreover, many people in Russia believe that the United States might actually profit from this conflict, because on the one hand, the conflict in Ukraine helps President Obama to discipline his allies in Europe. It might revitalize NATO. It might force NATO allies of the United States to increase their defense spendings, which has always been a problem for the United States, to make Europeans pay for the Atlantic defense. Some would say that the United States might profit because one of the outcomes of the conflict will be a new energy map of Europe. And the United States might squeeze the Russians out of the European energy markets and will replace the Russian gas with its own gas, specifically with the shale gas. So many here in Moscow, especially those who are, well, I would say, pursuing these conspiracy theories, they believe that the whole conflict in Ukraine was instigated by the United States in order to gain more positions on the European continent and to make life for President Putin more difficult. Some would say that this is a revenge for Snowden, and this notorious story when Snowden got shelter in Moscow, and allegedly President Obama was really infuriated with the behavior of President Putin, and he decided to pay back. But I don't buy these theories, of course, but many people do believe in them.
So you guys have conspiracy theorists too, huh?
Oh yeah, very much so.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh.
That always seems to be a problem here too. Well, those are very good. The very interesting thing about that oil one, that's for sure. We always get blamed everywhere we go that we're doing it for oil. I guess who really knows, huh?
Well, that's right. But here in Russia, again, they believe that the whole decline of oil prices was something engineered by the United States in order to undercut both Russia and Iran, while others believe that it was a conspiracy of Saudis and other Gulf states against the United States, because the producers of oil in the Persian Gulf don't want to see the US shale oil get into global markets. So it's very difficult to figure out who is behind this and whether anyone can be behind this, because oil prices are almost like weather. You cannot predict them. You can make your predictions, but the odds are that you'll be wrong.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because I know we had a guest on here a couple of weeks ago, a government official from Canada, a former parliament member, and he actually believed, I think he came up with the idea too, that the Saudis were responsible for this kind of I would just say, revenge or retaliation for Russia supporting Syria. And that was kind of his theory on that. Do you think that's plausible?
Well, I think that definitely Saudis do have some influence on energy markets. They are a big producer. They might cut down their supply. They can increase the production quite easily. However, let me say that Saudis are not interested in low oil prices because they will have their own budget problems. If you look at the Saudis' social programs, these programs are very expensive. And the country can literally go bankrupt in 2 or 3 years from now if oil prices stay at the level where they are right now. So I think that even if Saudis manipulate the oil market, they cannot do it for too long. And it's not in their best interest to keep oil prices very low for an extended period of time.
It's a good point. Excellent point. All right, so this is where a couple more questions, and then we're going to get into how Russia sees the world. But before that, so can we overcome the geopolitical issue of rivalry and competition between the new international players that are coming in and the old ones?
Well, I think we should. I think we should, because if we don't, we have a real problem. If you look around, you'll see that over the last 20 years, we've been accumulating points of instability in the world. There are conflicts that we cannot really handle. None of us, neither the United States, nor Russia, nor China. We see a problem, let's say, in Syria, but it is also Iraq, which is very fragile. No one really knows what will happen in Afghanistan. No one knows how the situation in Libya, in adjacent countries will turn out. So basically, if we do nothing, the odds are that at some point we will be hit with a very major crisis. But the question is, what is going to unite us? And some would say that unless there are aliens invading the Earth, it is implausible to see all the countries of the world getting together and deciding that they should stick together. But definitely, if we don't hang together, the odds are that we will be in a very serious problem, probably before we even think about that.
Yeah, absolutely right. We're getting in a mess right now. It's kind of scary when you said, not even China, Russia, or America can really do much about some of these issues. And that's disconcerting. But before we get to those issues, I guess my last question on this topic is, are there economic benefits to globalization? It seems like there would be. Some say it causes more income inequality. Others say, no, it's very good. It helps everybody rise. What do you think?
Well, I think that definitely globalization is positive, and moreover, it is inevitable. We cannot stop it. None of us can stop it. So we should try to make it probably more fair to people around the world, because the overall, let's say, global incomes are going up. The life expectancy goes up. There are fewer diseases and fewer poverty regions in the world. But at the same time, it's very uneven. The process is very uneven. And basically, globalization means that we are getting more and more dependent on factors which we cannot control. I cannot control something happens in China, something happens in Africa, and we see rapid changes. We see changes in currency rates. We can see changes in oil prices. We can see climatic changes. Something happens in Japan, there is a nuclear accident, and the Russian Far East suffers, and the other way around. So basically, when we live in the global world, we cannot isolate ourselves from risks and challenges associated with the outside environment. We have to live with that. And this is one of the issues. We have to find some way to govern our affairs together. And we should go beyond our immediate ambitions, our short-sighted interests. We should think in strategic terms. And this is difficult even for democratic countries because the President of the United States has to think about re-election. He has to think about a new cycle of the political game. And it's very difficult to think strategically what will happen in 10 or 20 years from now.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a big challenge. I mean, our elections are starting earlier and earlier every time. It's a four-year presidency, and we start 3 years before the next one comes up.
Yeah.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
This is going to be the fascinating part for me, and I'm sure for many people. So we're going to take a cruise around the world here. We're going to see what Russia sees. We know what America sees in some of these things, or at least what the media tells us America sees. So what does Russia think right now? What do they think about Syria? What's going on there for them? How does it impact Russia? Do they think they can help at all? Do they want to help at all?
Well, on Syria, I think that the Russian position is that we should not really focus on Assad because we might be very critical of Assad, and probably we should be, but we should think about what alternative do we have. And if we have no alternative, then we should compromise for the time being and focus on the terrorists in Syria and Iraq, rather than on fighting the regime of Assad. Because Russians say, okay, you want Assad out, fine, but who is going to replace him? Who is going to be there in the driver's seat? And there is no answer. That makes Russians very concerned, because Syria is close to Russia's borders.
Did you have any problems with Russia? I mean, with Syria and the border, or no?
One of the problems that we see here in Syria is that there are arguably at least 1,000 people fighting in Syria who came from Russia. These are mostly, extremists from Northern Caucasus. And of course, they will get trained in Syria. They will get arms in Syria. They will be even further indoctrinated in Syria. And when the war is over, they might get back. Not just, Russians, but people from Europe. For example, there are many fighters in Syria who have citizenship of major European countries. And what happens when they're back to their respective countries? No one really knows.
That's actually something I want to explore with you. What is going on with Russia? Inside Russia, we don't see it very often. We don't hear about it very often. But what's the feeling like in Russia about terrorists going into Russia? About the Muslim faith in Russia. I mean, is there a lot of tension there? Do you see that? Because I know France has a lot of tension right now with the Muslims. Unfortunately, a lot of innocent Muslims have nothing to do with anything or are feeling this pain. What's going on there with Russia? Do they have a lot of issues? I know Chechnya was a big problem.
I would venture to say that, we have a slightly different experience with Muslims because in Russia, Muslims in many cases are not migrants. They are indigenous. There are enclaves of the Muslim population inside Russia. And basically, with these Muslims, Russians lived for many, many centuries. And there is a kind of, accommodation. So we don't have real problems with Tatars or with the Bashkirs or with other Muslims who lived in Russia for a very, very long period of time, who lived there as long as Russians themselves lived in this part of the world. But there is this incoming Islam, which is much more radical, which is much less tolerant. And I think that the concern in Russia is that local Muslims would be somehow intoxicated with this more radical version of Islam. And that constitutes a real problem, because Russia is a country which is becoming more and more attractive for migrants. If you look at the statistics over the last 15, 20 years, the number of people who came to live in Russia, Russia is number 2 in the world after the United States as a recipient country for migrants. So there are many people who are coming in, and there are many of them who are Muslims, and for them it is not always easy to somehow get integrated into a different society. So we are concerned about the migrant Islam rather than about the indigenous Islam.
That's very fascinating. Yeah, that's a whole different perspective completely, which is why we have you here. So another part, Afghanistan, that's very close to Russia too, and you have a long history there. What do you think is going to happen here in the next few years? Because I know they have elections coming up.
Well, definitely Taliban will increase its influence. The only question is what shape this influence will take. Will we see a new civil war or a gradual shift, and probably Taliban will get its fair share of power in Kabul, or we might see a gradual further disintegration of the country with the local warlords having the upper hand, and Afghanistan will remain only formally an integrated country. Definitely, there are very many problems, social problems, economic problems, cultural problems, and also we should keep in mind that you cannot separate Afghanistan from neighboring Pakistan. So many talk about the so-called FPAC problem, which unites Afghanistan and Pakistan, and many argue that Pakistan is also a very fragile state, and this state might implode at some point. Now, of course, many in Russia are concerned about what will happen when and if the international coalition leaves the country, but we know that though formally the withdrawal has been completed, there are really many Americans with their boots on the ground right now in Afghanistan, and we cannot really say that the United States is out. When the United States is out, if it is completely, it will be a different ball game.
And really will be. Is Russia trying to prepare for that?
Well, of course, but our mission is really to fortify, so to say, the northern flank. It means that we should forge more active cooperation with Central Asian states, which have always been close to Russia, and which at least many of them rely on the military support and some security guarantees from Russia.
Yeah, Mr. Putin's got
it also
means
that, yeah, it's also about working with countries like Iran, for example. Iran plays a major role in the region, and it will definitely affect the situation in Afghanistan as well.
Yeah, Mr. Putin's got his hands full. He's got Ukraine on this side, he's got Syria down here, he's got Afghanistan. Boy, he is a busy man. So, what's going on? What's the Russian view about some other countries that are communist still, North Korea and Cuba? What are the Russians' opinions there?
Well, as far as North Korea is concerned, I think the position of Russia is something which is shared by Chinese, is that we don't want to see the country collapsing. We don't want to see an implosion of the country, which will generate millions of refugees and probably a civil war and a lot of chaos which might affect neighboring regions. Russia borders North Korea. It's a small border, but nevertheless, we have a border with Korea, and we have many Koreans living in Russia. So we don't want to see any rapid, uncontrolled developments. At the same time, Russia, and I think China as well, do not want to see a nuclear North Korea. And I don't think that at any point in future, Russia would accept the nuclear status of North Korea. That's why the Russian position is that we should resume the six-party talks. We should, get together and make sure that our position is the same the same as the position of China and Japan and South Korea and the United States. So only, we all together can convince North Koreans to reconsider their nuclear posture. I know that, at least allegedly, the North Korean leader is going to visit Moscow later this year, and I'm sure that there'll be some negotiations about bilateral relations between Moscow and Pyongyang, but at the same time about the multilateral arrangements in Northeast Asia, because, of course, for North Koreans, security guarantees are important. One of the reasons why the regime is pursuing nuclear weapons is because they don't feel secure. They believe that the United States in particular, but maybe also its allies like Japan and South Korea, are in the business of a regime change. And if it is the case, then North Korean leaders believe that nuclear weapons is the only insurance policy they have at their disposal. So it would be strange to imagine that they would turn down this option if it's the only option that they have.
That's going to be a tough one. He is an interesting character, needless to say. What do you think is happening in Cuba? They used to have relations with Russia there. That seems to have changed a little bit. What's going on now with Cuba and Russia?
Well, I think that formally, we have great relations with Cuba. President Putin made a stop in Havana when he visited Latin America for the BRICS summit in Brazil. He met with Fidel Castro and with other Cuban leaders, and I think that Russia wrote off 90% of the Cuban debt, which was a considerable sum of money. But I wouldn't be surprised to see that folks sitting in the Kremlin are watching with a lot of concern the current rapprochement between Cuba and the United States, because definitely in Moscow they don't want Cuba to get back to the status of the closest American ally in the Caribbean. I don't think that they would like to see such a U-turn in the Cuban foreign policy. It's probably too early to talk about that, but definitely not everybody here in Moscow is happy about the dialogue between Washington and Havana.
Oh, really interesting. What is one of the concerns they have?
Well, they have some military installations there in Cuba, and Cuba is a strategic partner of Russia in many conflicts, and there are traditions for more than 60 years of very close relationship, and there is also a kind of emotional attachment to Cuba. For generations, Russians believe that Cuba is the island of freedom, that Cuba can stand up against the American domination, and it's a kind of flagship of Latin America. So it would be a disappointment to see Cuba, if it indeed happens, to become a kind of loyal American ally.
Interesting. We have a couple minutes left. Question about hacking, and then we have what we call a fastball question, which is a fun question. We'll ask you that at the end. I forgot to prep you on that, but we'll let you know about it in a minute. So hacking, is that a big problem in Moscow?
Well, it's right now it's very cold here.
You mean the hacking?
Well, I don't know. I don't know, but I suppose the hacking is quite popular here.
No, but I mean, do you guys have a lot of problems being hacked by like North Korea or anything like that?
It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. But I assume that it is probably the case. if you take North Korea and some other rogue states, I think for them it is natural to exploit the current anti-Americanism in Moscow and to, claim some additional perks from Moscow because they are so anti-American.
All right, here's your fastball question. Are you ready, sir?
Oh, yeah, sure. As
Well,
always.
I've seen a lot of about Mr. Putin, and I know he's a very good wrestler. Would Dr. Kortnoff wrestle Putin?
No, not in my lifetime. I would prefer something more intelligent, like chess. And, I suspect that I can resist Putin in chess. At least I'm as ambitious as to claim that.
Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Kortnoff, for being on the circle. We truly appreciate it, getting an inside look of Russia.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, even in Moscow, we're there. See you next time, everyone.